Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the Kevin Michael Grace Show. An unusual situation, North America, this spring and summer, which is that teachers have not been in the classroom, students have not been in the classroom. Teachers have been engaging in distance education, I suppose, for a minority of students, which means what? They're talking from their computer via Zoom or some such for an hour or two a day and still pulling down their salaries. Well, the COVID-19 epidemic is busted now. Herd immunity has been reached. The numbers of deaths are falling rapidly. And in fact, much more than it would seem, because of course the death tolls are delayed, often for weeks. So that's good news, right? It means that school will begin again. Not so fast. Not so fast. I guess the teachers have decided that they like being paid for staying home. There are many stories around the world on this subject, but let's go to one from CBS Los Angeles. The superintendent for the Los Angeles Unified School District announced Monday that students will not return to the classroom when the fall semester begins next month because of the surge in coronavirus cases across the Southland. LAUSD Superintendent Austin Buettner said that the fall semester will begin August 18th. However, student learning will begin online only, with no students returning to in-person classes. Now, I just have to say that if it's possible to educate children this way, and I'm not saying that it is, but what do we need schools for then? In fact, why do we need so many teachers? Why do we need so many teachers? Because it's not really a question of the number of students in the classroom. Of course, student union or teachers unions have been fanatical about trying to get that number down to below 20. Not that there's any empirical evidence that smaller class sizes in public schools result in better outcomes. The research on that was done years ago by Richard Vedder of Ohio State University, and he decided that about 35 per classroom seems to have the best outcomes. But the teachers want smaller classes because that means, wait for it, more teachers. Let's see, along with LAUSD, the San Diego Unified School District will also begin its fall semester in a virtual format. The two districts released a joint statement confirming the move. Both districts will continue planning for a return to in-person learning during the 2020 to 2021 academic year as soon as public health conditions allowed. Buettner did not provide an estimate regarding when in-person classes might resume. The right way to reopen schools is to make sure there's a robust system of testing and contact tracing to mitigate the risk for all in the school community, Buettner said. Contact tracing. They're still talking about that. There's no evidence that anyone has been able to make it work, but never mind that. All this comes after United Teachers Los Angeles, the union which represents LAUSD teachers, announced Saturday that of 18,000 members who took part in a poll, 83% voted against physically reopening schools to students. The union applauded the school board's announcement. It was the right thing to close school campuses then. It's the right thing to keep them closed now, UTLA President Cecily Mayart Cruz said in a statement. In the face of the alarming spike in COVID cases, the lack of necessary funding from the government to open school safety, and the outsized threat of death faced by working class communities of color, there is really no other choice that doesn't put thousands of lives at risk. Let's see, outsized threat of death faced by working class communities of colors, username available. Schools statewide began operating remotely in mid-March with students using programs such as Zoom and Google Classroom to connect with their teachers and complete their coursework to finish out the 2019 to 20 academic year. LAUSD itself closed campuses on March the 16th. It's the second largest district in the nation. It serves more than 600,000 students at more than 1,000 schools, employs about 75,000 people. Again, 75,000 people. And how many of those people have been working since March the 16th? How many of those 75,000 people are actually necessary? Last week, President Donald Trump pressured states to reopen schools this fall, despite the spike in coronavirus cases, both in Southern California and nationwide. Throughout Sunday, LA County has reported 133,549 cases and 3,322 deaths from the disease. Let's see, this is from the Lansing State Journal in Michigan. COVID-19 is pushing more teachers to consider retirement. Teaching fourth graders is Barb Knighton's life, but she's considering whether it's worth risking her life to do it. In an age of COVID-19, a growing number of teachers, like Knighton, who teaches at Elmwood Elementary School and Waverly Community Schools, are worried about returning to the classroom. Many are considering leaving their schools, leaving the profession, or retiring altogether. I never thought I would consider retiring at 55. I never thought that would be a decision I would have to make, said Knighton, who has been teaching for 30 years. But I'm absolutely looking into what my payout would be, what our finances would be, and what would be the possibility of retiring from public health and doing online teaching as a way not to let go of teaching. I wonder, have there been any studies done on the efficacy of this online teaching? Now, I'm taking a look at the teacher who is written up in this story, and I noticed one thing about her right from the start. She is morbidly obese. So yes, I suppose that she would be at much greater risk of COVID-19, despite her relatively young age, than most people. As public schools around Michigan prepare to resume school operations in the fall, whether it be in-person classes, remote learning, or a hybrid model featuring both, the Michigan Education Association is hearing similar concerns among its more than 100,000 members. Of the 15,000 educators who responded to an MEA survey, 32% said they were contemplating leaving public education or retiring early. Yeah, I'm kind of wondering about this. If a large number of teachers do retire early, and given the financial situation of states like Michigan and others, particularly those which are run by Democratic administrations, one wonders how many of these retiring teachers will be replaced. We were already facing a dire shortage of educators, said David Krim, MEA spokesperson. If 5% or even 10% decide to retire early or not come back, that creates the potential for classrooms to be without a teacher when school reopens. It would cause nightmares for school administrators who have already pre-pandemic been scrambling to find certified teachers to staff their buildings. Why do they need to be certified? How difficult is it to teach from a textbook to elementary students? I should think that any reasonably intelligent and patient person should be able to do that. But no, everyone has got to have a certificate. Here's a story from Tammy Luby of CNN. 1 in 4 teachers at greater risk from coronavirus. Nearly 1.5 million teachers are at higher risk of serious illness if they contract coronavirus, according to an analysis released Friday. These teachers and instructors, about 24% of the total, suffer from health conditions such as diabetes, heart disease, or obesity, or are older than age 65, which will make them more vulnerable, the Kaiser Family Foundation report found. The share of teachers at high risk based on criteria identified by the Centers for Disease Control is the same as for workers overall, Kaiser said. Schools face the challenge of high traffic and tight quarters, which could make social distancing difficult. Yes, as it has been through all of the many flu epidemics of the 20th century. Yes, exactly. High traffic and tight quarters. But somehow the teachers were not so keen to flee from their duty. The analysis comes as the nation is engulfed in a debate over whether it's safe to bring children back into the classroom this fall. President Trump ramped up the pressure this week on state officials to reopen schools in the fall, threatening to withhold federal funding. Oh, that bad man, orange bad man, does it again. Well, if the schools aren't going to teach, why should they be getting federal funding? And of course, why are they getting federal funding in the first place? I remember when Ronald Reagan said that he was going to close down the Federal Department of Education. Many teachers and parents remain concerned about being able to keep children and their instructors safe, especially as the number of cases surges across the nation and more than 24 states have halted or starting to roll back their reopening plans. I should think that parents are far more interested in their children actually going to school. Because if they're not at school, who's going to be looking after them? I suppose the mothers could stay home, but since so many women work, and it's not for pin money, it's necessary, this would cause a crisis. Local school leaders, public health experts, educators, and parents should be involved in the decision to open schools, and they must take into account factors including community spread of COVID-19 and the ability of schools to institute safety protocols, according to a joint statement released Friday by the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Federation of Teachers, National Education Association, and AASA, the School Superintendents Association. Returning to school is important for the healthy development and well-being of children, but we must pursue reopening in a way that is safe for all students, teachers, and staff. For instance, schools in areas with high levels of COVID-19 community spread should not be compelled to reopen against the judgment of local experts. A one-size-fits-all approach is not appropriate for return to school decisions, but others are worried about continuing distance learning, citing the toll it takes on children's education and parents' ability to return to their jobs. They have pointed to the fact that the kids are less likely to suffer serious illness from coronavirus. You don't say. Suppose there's also the problem of there'd still be a great number of homes in the United States that do not have computers. And this is mostly, obviously, poor people who are not able to take advantage of this distance education. Here's a story from Global News from Reuters. This is from Germany. Very few of 2,000 school children and teachers tested in the German state of Saxony showed antibodies to the novel coronavirus, a study found on Monday, suggesting schools may not play as big a role in spreading the virus as some had feared. Who had feared this? Who? I had never heard this. In hundreds of thousands of articles I've read about this? No, I'd never seen the suggestion that schools would play such a big role in spreading the virus. Germany began reopening schools in May, though debate continues as to the role children may play in spreading the virus to vulnerable adults at home, as well as to older teachers and school staff. Germany began reopening schools in May. Well, aren't the Germans supposed to be, science-based? Don't they have that PhD, Angela Merkel, in charge? And yet they began opening schools in May. The study by the University Hospital in Dresden analyzed blood samples from almost 1,500 children aged between 14 and 18 and 500 teachers from 13 schools in Dresden and surrounding districts. Of the almost 2,000 samples, only 12 had antibodies, adding that the first results gave no evidence that school children play a role in spreading the virus particularly quickly. Children may even act as a brake on infection, said Reinhard Berner from the University Hospital of Dresden, saying infections in schools had not led to an outbreak, while the spread of the virus within households was also less dynamic than previously thought. So why can't we open the schools? Well, apparently it's not about the children. It's about their scaredy cat teachers who are constantly talking about their deep, deep commitment to their students, how vital a role they play. But they've had several months off, and it just seems they're not willing to go back. Some of them are demanding that the police be defunded and such like. They have a bunch of political demands there as well. Teachers worry about how we'll keep them safe if their schools open. Kids don't go to school by themselves. Again, this is from CNN. After months out of the classroom, Sarah Gross, a high school English teacher in New Jersey, is eager for schools to reopen in the fall, but she's skeptical about how that could happen safely as COVID-19 cases rise across the country. You notice they keep talking just about the cases. They're not talking about hospitalizations, and they're not talking about deaths, which again strongly suggests to me that even at CNN, they know that COVID-19 is much less of a risk than they have pretended for months. And it's much, much, much less of a risk for people under the age of 70, as it turns out. Teachers who spoke to CNN said they're trying to puzzle out an avalanche of unanswered questions about schooling amid a global pandemic. As coronavirus cases numbers rise, they're weighing the risks to students and colleagues, their families, and themselves. Top of mind for many educators are the health risks involved with returning to the classroom, particularly for their own families and fellow educators. Phil Strunk, 28, a middle school U.S. history teacher in Northern Virginia, said he would love to go back to school as long as we do it safely. Well, unless Phil is in very bad health, COVID-19 constitutes almost zero risk to him. But no, I guess we're going to find out just how powerful the teachers' unions are. I was watching Red Letter Media over the weekend, and they were complaining that in Wisconsin, they've shut everything down now for the third time. Shut and reopen, shut and reopen, shut again for the third time. This suggested to them that the state of Wisconsin didn't know what it was doing, which is I don't know, pretty daring speculation, because isn't the state of Wisconsin being counseled by experts? This is from the Daily Mail. Governor Gavin Newsom orders bars and movie theaters to close and bans indoor dining, while LA and San Diego school districts announce students will not return in the fall over surge in COVID-19 cases. Newsom shared that due to alarming COVID-19 spread across California, the state will be closing indoor operations statewide for restaurants, wineries, movie theaters, family entertainment, zoos, and museums. Bars must close all operations, Newsom said, as California confirmed coronavirus cases increased to 329,000. At least 7,040 people in California have died from the virus. How many tens of millions of people live in California? Oh, just let me check here. This won't take long, okay? Because that does not really sound like end of the world stuff, particularly since most of the people who have died are over the age of 80. So the population is 39.5 million in California, which is an awful lot of people. But I am looking at a picture of Gavin Newsom here, and how long is his hair going to grow? Is it going to, are we going to get to like late 60s, early 70s rock star length here? Because he's kind of got this mullet thing going. I guess he is just not going to get a haircut until there's a vaccine. Could get pretty ropey. Let's see. What else do we have here? Must close. Fitness centers, places of worship, offices for non-critical sectors, personal care services, hair salons, barbershops, and malls. A Newsom's move, which undoes weeks of reopening efforts in parts of the most populous U.S. state, comes as several rural counties are experiencing strains to their hospital systems while cases mount in large metropolitan areas, including Los Angeles and parts of the San Francisco Bay Area. Gavin Newsom, he probably thinks he's doing an outstanding job, just as the governor of New York does, and we will get to him in a minute. Oh dear, one Florida doctor said the state's rapidly increasing number of COVID-19 cases is turning Miami into the epicenter of the pandemic. I thought New York City was the epicenter of the pandemic. There are many, many, many times more deaths in New York State than in Florida. Oh, yes, before we turn to Britain and its continually bumbling response to this, let's go to the chat. How about the hybrid? Oh, I don't even know what that means, says Coachulango. And you've seen the proposals that there's going to be circles and kids are going to be in the circles, and people aren't going to be allowed to eat together, and they're going to be doing this in shifts, and no contact between teachers and students allowed. It's obviously completely unworkable. Dawn from Beyond says, dashing today, met elderly school teacher, dashes during summer. She's terrified to go back to school next month. Volusia County makes the big decision, 7:15. I need to send some emails pronto. Jonathan Pohl says, large classes of Kurds and Arabs are impossible to teach. They refuse to be quiet. Okay, I'll tell you a boomer story here, that when I went to school, class sizes were typically between like 35 and 40. And this made discipline imperative because you had to have the children, shut up and keep still. Otherwise, people would not have learned anything. Of course, there were rows of desks in those days in order to facilitate solitary work, which apparently is not considered the best thing anymore. Frankly, I don't know how anyone could get any work done in a classroom with all of the jabbering and walking around and all the rest of it that's going on, including the integration of students who should not be integrated. Lives in the balance. Yes. British American says, hi, Kevin. What do you think of my idea of the RCMP as the perfect symbol of traditional Canadian British Americanism, the red tunic of the British Army with the very American Stetson hat? Perhaps. It's just that, I live in Western Canada, and frankly, the RCMP are not particularly held in high regard here since their behavior has been appalling for years and years and years, and it is very difficult. Well, 5-day suspension for the most egregious behavior from the RCMP, and after that, there is expulsion. And so the Mounties get away with, killing people, like that Polish fellow at Vancouver Airport, or actually one of the Mounties who was involved in that incident later killed a man on a motorcycle. Got away with it. Don from Beyond, I had quite an argument with that white-haired school teacher today. I tell everyone how the virus is a scam and a hoax. My grandson needs to go to the first grade next month. Enough is enough. Well, that's certainly what Donald Trump is counting on. That keeping the children out of school, I mean, it was a tremendous novelty at first, I guess. But now there's some serious questions that have to be answered. Like, how long can this literally go on for? I certainly would like to return to a day when mothers raised their own children, but our economy is not structured anymore to allow that to happen. And so, we have a situation where you will have these women talking about, part-time work and the like. I remember David Fromm's wife talking about that, and I thought, yeah, there's not very many women around who have foundations paying for them to edit, a quarterly journal that no one reads. She was a lucky woman. What happened to Thursday's show down the memory hole? What? Let me check here. No, let's see, 96, 97, 98, 95. It's there. I'll just refresh again. 99, 98, 97, 96, 95. Whew. Scared me there. You scared me there. It still seems to be up there on YouTube. Exodus to homeschool imminent. Well, that would be a very good thing. That would be a very good thing as well. Hot for morbidly obese teacher, Aerosmith song for 2020. Yo Mama says the problem is schools don't let teachers discipline the students. I think it's 6 of one, half a dozen on the other. I think that the the teachers today are loath to discipline the students, but the system certainly does not encourage it, particularly, well, not just in the United States, in Ontario now, where you do not want to be a teacher that is responsible for disciplining a vibrant student, because all manner of unpleasantness will result. Jonathan Paul says it's extremely difficult to teach immature students because they are deliberately disruptive and you can't shout over 100 screaming children. That is true. That is true. And I don't know how you can actually enforce discipline in a classroom without corporal punishment, frankly. I really don't know how that's possible. The stuff that my children told me about the stuff that goes on, that went on in their schools, and I'll repeat that the school that the high school that my children went to on Vancouver Island was ranked the second best academically. But apparently teachers or students yell at their teachers, they swear at their teachers, they throw things, they stomp out, and not much happens as a result. Walrus Libertarian says the government is trying to stop the suspension of naughty diverse students in Ontario. I couldn't believe it. Yes, this man called Stephen Lecce, who's the education minister, who seems to be the premier of Ontario in all but name. And he announced the end of streaming, 2 weeks ago, because streaming means that fewer children are going to go to university. Of course, the obvious question is, why do all of these school students have to go to university? Apparently, Ontario is the province where all the children are above average, just like Lake Wobegon. Jonathan Paul says juvenile detention camps need to make a comeback. When I was a boy, going to school in Vancouver, there was this detention camp on Vancouver Island called Brannan Lake. And every so often you'd hear it referred to in hushed tones that, you better start behaving yourself, young man, or you might find yourself in Brannan Lake. Ooh, Brannan Lake. I don't know. We don't know. That they were fed on gruel or whatever. They slept in barracks, cut down trees, some such. Not it horrible. David Wright says most teachers face no such thing, which would be, violent students. Okay, well, I suppose it depends on what school you're teaching at. Metal Mike says not only that, the RCMP traveled to Poland to try and dig up dirt on their victim. They interviewed his ex-girlfriend, for example. I'm not aware of that, but it does not surprise me because this is one of the greatest embarrassments in the history of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. But this mysterious shooting in Nova Scotia may turn out to be the greatest embarrassment in the history of the RCMP, particularly if it turns out if this mass killer was on the RCMP payroll, despite being obviously bonkers. Okay, so this is from the Daily Mail. £100 fine for not masking up. Police are to hand out on-the-spot penalties for anyone not wearing a face covering in shops when it becomes compulsory from July the 24th. Yes. Oh, let's see. Oh, under plans to stop the second wave. So people weren't wearing masks when the death rate was relatively high. Now that the death rate has collapsed, everyone has to wear masks. I was out in front of my apartment building a couple of days ago, and I discovered that masks are now required on BC Transit buses, which means I'm not going to get on a transit bus. I have a general rule that I walk everywhere, and if it's too far to walk, then it's too far away for me. So this will simply reinforce that rule. Although I saw a bus go by earlier today, and I seem to see quite a few people who are not wearing masks, although perhaps they were flesh colored. Only young people or those with certain disabilities will be exempt from the new regulations which come in. Oh, retailers will be asked to advise customers to wear masks, but their staff will not be expected to enforce the law. And if you say that you have an exemption from wearing a mask, who is in a position to doubt you? Are you required to provide a doctor's note? Look, the British economy was smashed by Boris Johnson quite deliberately. And let's get the country moving again. No, you got to wear masks everywhere. That's really going to help. Let's look at some of the numbers here. The UK announced 11 more coronavirus deaths in the preliminary daily toll. 11. A whole United Kingdom. That does not really sound like it's much of a crisis anymore. More than 100 outbreaks of coronavirus in schools, businesses, and pubs are swiftly and silently being dealt with every week across the UK, Health Secretary Matt Hancock revealed. The drive to bring workers back to the office from coronavirus lockdown hit a roadblock after some of the country's biggest firms said only 40% will return from home. Well, yes. These companies with their thousands or tens of thousands of employees, how many of these employees are surplus to requirements? Rather a lot, I should think, rather a lot. Councils in England are preparing to make significant cuts in jobs and services after losing income on investments in airports, cinemas, and offices amid the coronavirus pandemic. Again, I have to point this out. So you have all these government workers who have not been working and they have been paid. So the level of service, has collapsed? That Britain is about to implode because of the loss of the governmental workforce? Again, this very much suggests that, half of these people could be fired at a stroke. We saw under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown that the civil service has simply exploded in size. Why did it explode in size? Well, because the Labour Party wants voters. And there's no better way to get a vote than to give a man or a woman a job, a good paying job. Let's see. Michael Gove said that it was basic good manners to wear masks in shops. You notice how this has changed? They're not talking about health. They're talking about good manners. It's not really very reassuring. Gove said it was always better to trust to people's common sense. A Whitehall source played down the idea of a cabinet split, but acknowledged that Gove's intervention had been unhelpful. How the government's line on face coverings has changed over the month. March 12th, Deputy Chief Medical Officer Dr. Jenny Harries, for the average member of the public walking down the street, it is not a good idea. In fact, you can actually trap the virus in the mask and start breathing it in. Oh dear. April 16th, Chief Medical Officer Professor Chris Whitty said the evidence is weak, but the evidence's small effect is there under certain circumstances. On August 21st, SAGE advised, on balance, there is enough evidence to support recommendation of community use of cloth face masks for short periods in enclosed spaces where social distancing is not possible. On April 23rd, Dr. Harry said there could be a very, very small potential beneficial effect in some enclosed environments. The next day, Matt Hancock said, on masks, as more information comes through, the science is constantly evolving, and we always bear in mind that science, and then take the decision. As of today, the government position is unchanged. On April 30th, Prime Minister Johnson said, I do think that face coverings will be useful both for epidemiological reasons, but also giving people confidence they can go back to work. On May 20th, researchers in Hong Kong found face masks reduced infection by up to 75%. Yes, those ultra-reliable Chinese figures. And then by June, we're talking about compulsory use. And again, as I pointed out ad nauseum, there's no medical consensus whatsoever on the efficacy of masks. This lockdown, it's sadism, pure and simple. And apparently, British people aren't suffering enough. Calls for smoking to be banned outside bars, restaurants, and cafes over health fears have been slammed by angry pub owners and customers. Ministers will face demands today to require pubs and cafes to ban outdoor smoking over fears of an increased risk of secondhand smoke. Peers are set to urge ministers to introduce the new rules as venues move tables outdoors amid the easing of lockdown measures. However, the proposals have attracted criticism from the pub industry and customers on social media. Kyle Michael from the Launton Arms in Launton, Oxfordshire said, "As a non-smoker myself, I personally would welcome non-smoking areas, but as a publican facing one of the worst challenges with COVID we've faced since the indoor smoking ban, this is not a welcome move, and it seems some politicians simply do not understand pubs at all." The threat of secondhand smoke, secondhand smoke indoors is statistical static, 0.19. This is after juking the stats, after cherry picking the results and lowering the statistical confidence level. The best they could come up is 0.19, which is statistical static. The risk of secondhand smoke outdoors is zero. It is simply zero. One Briton wrote on social media, "What is it with some politicians and their determination to decimate the economy and attack ordinary people? You haven't figured it out? Why do people go into politics? To boss people around." A second said, "Pubs will suffer for this. People are so damn precious about being offended by a bit of smoke." Well, most pubs have restaurants in them, or they make some sort of food, typically fried food, and inhalation of cooking oil is a serious carcinogen. But perhaps, these places should be closed, and, all the food in pubs should be microwaved. But no, people like to smoke. Still a fair number of people like to smoke, and they're prepared to step outside, risking having their drinks taken, risking having their belongings stolen, going out in the rain and the like. And apparently this simply isn't good enough. And the British government seems determined to destroy the pub. They would prefer that people buy their cheap booze from Tesco's and get drunk inside alone. Can't have that conviviality. People may say things to each other, things which are best not said. Oh, what's the latest from The Who? Coronavirus crisis may get worse and worse and worse. That is a direct quotation, by the way. Let me be blunt. Too many countries are headed in the wrong direction. The virus remains public enemy number one. The WHO Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus told a virtual briefing from the UN agency's headquarters in Geneva. If basics are not followed, the only way this pandemic is going to go, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Global infections stand at 13 million, according to a Reuters tally, with more than 500,000 deaths. Again, how many people would have normally died during this period? They don't like to talk about that. Let's go to Toby Young at Lockdown Skeptics. A new working paper published in the National Bureau of Economic Research contains a shocking table. The respondents in the 18 to 34-year-old age group thought their risk of contracting COVID was about 8.8%. And if they caught it, their risk of being hospitalized about 7.5%, and their risk of dying 2%. If those figures were true, it would mean that 0.176% of 18 to 34-year-olds would die from coronavirus. There are 76.2 million Americans aged 18 to 34. So if the respondents' estimate of the risk was correct, that would mean 134,000 people in that age group will die. Needless to say, the real risk posed to 18 to 34-year-olds is far lower. Let's look from the deaths with age under 40. This is from Professor John Ioannidis at Stanford. In Canada, 6. In Switzerland, 5. In Italy, 57. In Germany, 8. In the UK, 133. A science professor has got in touch to comment on my piece in the Telegraph on Saturday, in which I claimed the UK was well on its way to achieving herd immunity. I cannot be any more specific than that because he doesn't want to be identified. But he says that, if anything, I understated it. I note your article today saying we're on our way to achieving herd immunity. The fact is, however, we have already achieved it. Once herd immunity has been achieved, the fraction of people infected starts to fall. Since R has been less than 1 for months now, then by definition, we achieved herd immunity at each point in time over those months for the way society was operating at each of those points in time. This does not prove we have enough immunity in the population to keep R less than 1, i.e. to maintain herd immunity if we ever fully release lockdown. But we both know the examples out there that suggest that we do have immunity. But got to keep the panic going. Now, Orange Bad Man has to be defeated in America, and Boris Johnson, I don't know how he can ever recover from this shambling man. Pierre Trudeau, he's doing an outstanding job, absolutely outstanding. And this scandal, this WE scandal, it's just frivolous, absolutely frivolous. A reader who has accepted the offer of a place at Oxford starting in the autumn contacted me a couple of months ago to ask me whether I thought it was worth going or whether they'd be better off deferring if they could. I said the situation might look less glum in a couple of months. Turns out I was wrong. You may already be aware of this, the student wrote, but I thought I'd draw your attention to the latest news on the arrangements for Oxford students in the autumn. Here's an excerpt from the website. From the start of the new academic year, face coverings will be required during face-to-face teaching and in indoor shared spaces, with exceptions for both individuals and settings where they are not appropriate, for example, on grounds of disability. Details on how this will operate will be consulted on. University libraries will operate social distancing through capacity limits with spacing of reader seats, one-way seats, and enhanced hygiene measures, as well as a seat finder app so that reading room spaces can be easily identified. Our spaces, both research and teaching, as well as social spaces, communal areas, and areas open to the public, will be adapted to ensure social distancing and appropriate ventilation are maintained in accordance with government and scientific advice. We will be timetabling activities and staggering timings to ensure social distancing measures are as effective as possible. Lectures will be online for at least the first term. Social distancing will also be in place, so I'm not holding out for much in the way of musical societies, drama, or group sport. I asked the student if they could defer for a year. Answer, probably not. According to the university website, will Oxford let offer holders defer their place to 2021 if they don't wish to start in October 2020? Subject to any public health conditions still being enforced, we are expecting to welcome a full cohort of new undergraduates in October 2020, so we will not routinely support requests for deferrals. Well, how about if Oxford wants to make this permanent? Just say, yeah, we're just going to go with this social distancing forever because you can't be too careful. And if you don't like it, lump it. We're not going to let you wait. We're not going to let you wait. Let's see the latest research from Switzerland on IFR, infection fatality rate. Most antibody studies have shown a population-based IFR of 0.1 to 0.3%. The CDC published in May a cautious best estimate of 0.26%. At the end of May, however, an immunological study by the University of Zurich was published, which for the first time showed that the usual antibody tests that measure antibodies in the blood can detect at most about 1/5 of all coronavirus infections. This means that the new coronavirus is probably much more widespread than previously assumed, and the lethality per infection is about 5 times lower than previously estimated. The real lethality could therefore be significantly below 0.1% and thus in the range of influenza. Carl Hennigan, the professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford, tweeted that there were no COVID deaths reported in hospitals in England on July the 10th, but perhaps the data source he was checking hadn't been updated because NHS England is now showing 6. But for July the 11th, the total was just 1. Won't be long now before we have a day in which no COVID deaths occur in England's hospitals. I predict it will happen sometime in the next 7 days. And I suppose the response to that would be we have to keep the lockdown going forever because of the second spike. Man plans to sue NHS after cancer surgery delayed due to coronavirus. A French bus driver was attacked by passengers after asking them to wear masks, which are compulsory on French public transport. He later died in hospital. Scots cancer deaths soar as 900 patients die at home during lockdown. Horrifying story in the Daily Record. Expect more headlines like this in the weeks and months to come. Well, these people who die at home not being treated for cancer and other diseases are saving the government a fortune. Now, I'm not going to suggest a direct link here. I'll just point out that fact and leave it at that. Leave it at that for now. I wonder how many investigations, royal commissions and the like, we are going to have following this. Here's a story from the Mail about cancel culture. Toby Young says, what's disturbing about cancel culture is that we've seen it so many times before: in 17th century Salem, in Paris after the French Revolution, in America during the McCarthy era, in China in the 1960s. It's as if a group of people are reenacting some of the worst moments in human history, but because they're not actually killing anyone, they think it's okay. Civil servant Stella Parrott had supplied edgy cartoons for the communist Morning Star newspaper for years, until February 20th, when she found that being on the left is no protection against cancelization. A lifelong feminist, she had strong views about self-identifying trans women being allowed into female-only spaces, such as domestic violence, refuge, and toilets. She got canceled because of this. According to some insiders, there was even talk of pulling the plug on the ailing newspaper. So within days came a much longer 600-word apology to its readers and a promise to the unions behind the scenes not to use Ms. Parrott again. A phone call from the police followed after a hate crime was reported and recorded, but the police confirmed yesterday that no further action was taken. Then someone in the PCS Civil Servants Union, for which Ms. Parrott was an unpaid official, started baying for her to be kicked out of her post. She was summoned to a disciplinary hearing. Manx radio presenter Stuart Peters was last month suspended following an argument with a listener on air, during which the broadcaster said he had not benefited from white privilege. It followed a blog post by Peters, 65, in which he had stated white lives matter in response to the worldwide Black Lives Matters protest. He said his suspension, following complaints from 13 people, but also messages of support from 27 listeners, amounted to an Orwellian attempt at mind and speech control. A few weeks later, he was cleared by the Isle of Man's Communications Commission, which said that while it considered his comments insensitive, they were not made to stir up racial hatred and not breach its broadcasting code. Peters returned earlier this month, but in a somewhat muzzled form, with the phone-in section of his show voluntarily reduced. Charlie Shakespeare had his plans for a virtual gay pride parade earlier this year torpedoed because he had retweeted statements from Nigel Farage and free speech campaigner Toby Young. Left-wing activists led by Labour's diversity advisor announced a boycott when an anonymous Twitter post revealed that he was a Tory supporter who had called for a clean break Brexit. And the Mail provides other such stories. There's a piece in Spiked. Now, Spiked is an interesting online publication. It comes out of a publication which was called LM, which was previously called Living Marxism, and the Revolutionary Communist Party. I read Living Marxism extensively in the 1990s and 2000s. I found it a very interesting magazine. The magazine eventually was poleaxed by some claims that it had made about atrocities during the Yugoslavian civil war. I suppose I have to be very careful about talking about that because anyone who doesn't take the line that the Serbs are very, very bad people is going to find himself in serious trouble with the authorities. There's Tim Knox writes, why we must always question the science. At every stage of the COVID-19 crisis, ministers have insisted they are following the science. And yet the result has been a catastrophe. Tim Knox is the former director of the Center for Policy Studies. He recently co-authored a report for Civitas on the UK's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, which highlights the dangerous role played by the blob, a narrow coterie of scientific advisors. What are the key failings in the UK's response to COVID-19 that you identify? The first is the death rate. The ways of measuring death rates are all fairly rough and ready, but the best figure to look at is the death rate per head of population. On that count, other than Belgium, the UK has the worst rate in the world, far worse than the United States. Then there are the economic costs of the virus and our response to it. The OECD has recently put out a report saying that the UK is the worst member state in terms of the possible costs. This was before the government's announcements about recovery spending, which will put up the costs even more. The third is something revealed in a study by the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford. They found that we were one of the worst prepared countries in the world for leaving lockdown. Only 3 countries scored worse: Algeria, Iran, and Nicaragua. That means the United Kingdom measured worse than many poorly run countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo and Papua New Guinea. How great is the scale of these failings and how large do you anticipate their costs to be? The death rates are very confusing. It is easy to forget when reading or watching mainstream coverage that the great majority of deaths have been people aged over 75. Interestingly, at the moment in the UK, our overall death rate for all cases, not just coronavirus, is actually lower than that which would be expected at this time. This can mean only one thing. A large number of those who died during the peak of the crisis actually just happened to accelerate their deaths by a few weeks. It is tragic, but it's not the same as dying many years early. Since most deaths from coronavirus were among the elderly, we should expect the overall death rate to continue to fall. In terms of the economy, the costs are dependent on so many known unknowns and so many unknown unknowns. Hang on, just give me 1 second here. There's just something I have to check. Okay, yeah, I've got that now. Back to the show. In terms of it's very clear that there's going to be a huge financial cost. There is no magic money tree. We are extraordinarily lucky that we're able to borrow at the rates we are. If we had not brought our overall economic situation into control over the last 10 years, I dread to think what position we would be in now. It would be substantially worse than that which Greece faced during the financial crisis. I think the big danger is inflation, which I feel is greatly underestimated. One very simple reason inflation is likely to rise is that there is a huge amount of money being printed. And at the same time, the number of products and services in circulation has fallen dramatically. Basic economics means that an increase in the money supply, along with a lower volume of goods and services being exchanged, will lead to significant inflationary pressures. What is the blob, and how is it responsible in part for the failings we have seen? The blob refers to a group of scientific advisors who, for historic reasons, have had a disproportionate impact on government policy, including during the pandemic. SAGE and Public Health England are right at the center of that. SAGE was set up in the immediate aftermath of the foot and mouth crisis and always wants to fight the last war, so to speak. Foot and mouth is a relatively simple disease, and people knew what it was at the time. But in many ways, our response to it may have been hugely overreactive. There are plenty of academic papers suggesting this, and Neil Ferguson appears to have been at the heart of that overestimation of the problem. That was the issue then. What is a more complicated more complicated problem now with our response to coronavirus is the question of whether this scientific blob did its job and whether ministers challenged its recommendations empirically enough. The position of SAGE changes from crisis to crisis, but it has been dominated by one particular group of epidemiologists. I'm not imputing any bad motives there. It is just how it is. It is a completely different group to the group from Oxford University who produced totally different models and forecasts. But this group had all the responsibility at the heart of government for forecasting. A new government came along and did something normal. It realized it could hide behind scientific advice and outsource all the decisions, and therefore the blame when things went wrong to SAGE. This is where the awful mantra of following the science came from. That phrase is the most aggravating in the world. Any scientist will tell you there is no such thing as the science. The whole point of science is that you are constantly challenging, questioning, and examining the existing consensus. Therefore, science always changes, especially when confronted with something as complicated as COVID-19. The government was, in fact, following the advice of one particular branch of the scientific community. There are many scientific groups and interpretations they could have drawn upon. In Germany, the equivalent of SAGE took a much broader approach. Not only did it have a greater range of types of scientists on it, but it also included historians, psychologists, and crowd behavior experts. They brought in everyone who could make a contribution. But in the UK, the view given was from one particular faction of one particular subset of scientists who had already been at the heart of government for 20 years. This ran against the advice of some public health officials who felt no one group should stay in place for so long. But because they were there for long enough, the problem started to perpetuate itself. They developed a groupthink mentality, which they were able to reproduce by appointing their friends to the group and shutting out people who were difficult or hostile to their views. They naturally became more and more arrogant. Why do you think the government was so inclined to listen to that particular part of the scientific community? And will they turn on them when it comes to apportioning blame for the failings? Knox says, the scientific blob was well established when the new government came in. As a result, they took it seriously, and I think they were incredibly concerned when they saw Ferguson's predictions, understandably, considering what he was warning about. Things felt like they were coming close to a breaking point. There was a hospital in London which very suddenly appeared to being overwhelmed. The government concluded that they had no choice but to press the button, as it were. There's potentially another aspect, too. If we cast our minds back to the Brexit campaign and Michael Gove being ridiculed for saying people were sick of experts, you start to wonder whether the government has been anxious to avoid being accused of a similar mentality to Gove's. They wanted to be seen to be trusting in and following the advice of the experts, and so decided to try and use the science as a shield. Now, as far as Neil Ferguson is concerned, Boris Johnson and his ministers have many, many staffers working for them. So let's see, we have this prediction from Imperial College London. Okay, get the staffers at work at this. What do we know about Neil Ferguson and Imperial College London? Has he made other predictions in the past? And how have these predictions turned out? It would have been the matter of a day, simply by doing Google searches, to discover that Professor Neil Ferguson has had an absolutely disastrous record of predictions, that he is a doom monger of the first order. And apparently every disease, whether it affects animals or people, that comes down the pike is going to be the end of life as we know it. So as far as blaming the experts, no, I blame Boris Johnson and his cabinet, because as I say, you know, Boris Johnson works he's a newspaper man. He was a magazine editor. And you call up some people or you do a Google search and you can come up with a lot of information in a short period of time. And that should have led to Neil Ferguson and his monstrous C model, undocumented C code, thousands of lines of it written 13 years ago, which does not come up with the same answer twice, ever, which does not work on multi-core processors. No. Experts are going to say all sorts of things. It's politicians who make the decisions, and it's politicians who have to be held responsible. John Miller says, laugh out loud at anyone that believes it's Democrats +5 in Texas. Yeah, I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. Manfred von Thistlebaum says people could sue the hell out of big tech. I don't know. I generally, my advice to people is not to sue ever, because particularly when you're dealing with people with lots and lots and lots of money, because you typically end up bankrupt and insane. De Boreas says, what's happening in Valhalla? I don't know. That's beyond my pay grade. Coachulango says, we need more lawfare. Lawfare. Yeah, well, I suppose lawfare begets lawfare. Far too much money, time spent on lawyers. What do you all think of Owen Benjamin's followers' lawsuit against Patreon? I'm not really familiar with it. I am assuming that he was kicked off Patreon and this lawsuit followed. David Wright says, reading the last few Buchanan, I suppose that would be Pat Buchanan articles, he really seems black-pilled on Trump's chances. Of course, he is a child of the political culture, believes polls, etc. Gijid says Trump is going to get destroyed. Again, I'll be getting into that. John Miller, I wouldn't put too much weight into summer polls. Polling in our country is a disaster, and summer polls are not predictive for November. Well, I'll point out one thing with regard to the current polling, which is that Joe Biden is the presumptive Democratic nominee. He is not yet the candidate. And so you only begin to, really see the strengths and weaknesses of the candidates after they have been anointed as the candidates. I'm sure to lots of Americans, Joe Biden is that really old guy with the insanely tightly stretched skin who shows up every so often to blunder through a sentence or two. I'm sure there's a lot of Americans, that Joe Biden guy, he is actually the candidate for president? Oh, I thought they were going to get someone else because this guy's clearly not up to the task. Oh, okay. Buchanan seemed like we have Dewey Truman election coming with Trump being Truman if he throws some Hail Marys. Well, I talked about schooling. And the closer we get to the start of schooling, traditional schooling, and the children aren't in school, many millions, tens of millions of parents, they are going to be panic-stricken and then furious. Don from Beyond says, I'm on a mission to red pill my sons and their spouses before the election to make sure they contribute to Trump Slide 2020. It's tough going, but we'll get there. Yeah, what in the summer, Dukakis was 16 points ahead of George H.W. Bush. Again, Americans traditionally don't take the presidential election seriously until Labor Day. And we're not there yet, are we? Still in July. Jim Smith, was it Churchill who said he was not a liberal at age 20, has no heart? If a liberal at 30, he has no head. I've heard variations on this. That seems to be from 20 to 30. It's not that many years. All sorts of things are attributed to people. I don't like Winston Churchill at all, but he said some memorable things. The favorite thing that Churchill said that I like, he said, "You shoot a mad dog first and feel sorry for it afterward." How many people here were liberal in their youth? Give your children time. I know we don't have much of that, though. I wasn't liberal exactly. Libertarian. Shameful. I know. Shameful. I suppose I was. When did I when did I stop believing in that? I think it was the immigration question that changed my mind during the 1980s. That Canada was being transformed before my eyes, and not in a good way. And I kept hearing that, this is the way of the world, this is the way of nature, there's nothing you can do about it. And don't you like foreign food? They didn't seem to me to be serious people. What sort of people bring up food? As the old joke goes, we have the recipes now. Don't get me going on what passes for teachers today, says David Wright. Well, if there's any, I don't want to insult any teachers who may be in the audience, but, I worked in a university for 12 years, and I found that the least competent students were always in the education department. I also found out, I worked for a school board for 3 years, and I found out that teachers, they work exactly as hard as they want to. If they want to show up just before 9 o'clock and leave right after 3 o'clock, they can do that. There's lots of teachers who put in extra work, but it's not necessary. And in my province of British Columbia, it is almost impossible to be fired as a teacher. You're talking about criminality here. I'm not talking about incompetence. Incompetence is not a consideration. Jan Reich says, why does the Anglosphere loathe the tobacco industry so much? I think it's because smokers are, apparently they're letting the world know that they're not particularly concerned with living forever, or they're willing to take that risk. They're willing to shave off 5 years from their lives, or whatever that number is supposed to be. And there are a fair number of people out there who seriously believe that they're going to live forever, that something's going to be discovered, before it's too late for them, so that they can, just keep going on. They can keep going on. And I know a lot of these people, I just imagine that if something happens to them, they're just, I went into that smoking section once, or I went into a restaurant with a smoking section, or whatever. And this is why Grand Rapids, nice city for the most part. Yes, soul crushing to see that nice place getting diseased. Killing businesses is the point, I believe. Well, I've been thinking about this for some time, particularly when I started about a decade ago. I started writing about the mining industry. And then I realized that the people who run my country, the elite of my country, and I'm sure it's a little different in the United States, they have no idea where wealth comes from, particularly the younger members of the elite. That wealth is simply taken as a given. And of course, the reason why that there are, poor people, or the reason that there are homeless people, is because of, selfishness or some such, or misallocation of resources, and they look down on people who work with their hands. They look down on the mining industry, on the oil and gas industry, because that's yucky, and it's dominated by men. A proper job is in an office where you have lots of meetings, and you have one of those, phone setups right in the middle of the table, and everyone is showing off, particularly the women. They're a couture. This is from the U.S. Sun. White House officials have reportedly released a list of all the times Dr. Anthony Fauci has been wrong about the coronavirus pandemic. Trump's administration is clashing with the top disease experts as the pandemic continues to surge in the United States. It came after Trump said last week that Fauci is a nice man, but he's made a lot of mistakes. Anonymous officials in the administration have been handing out a list of past comments made by the expert, which have turned out being inaccurate, reports CNBC. How is he an expert? He's a medical bureaucrat. He's not an epidemiologist. And anyway, epidemiology it's more statistics than medicine. The list included comments made in January that coronavirus, which has infected more than 3 million Americans, was not a major threat. It also highlighted Fauci saying that the virus was not driven by asymptomatic carriers, and his comment in March that people should not be walking around with masks. An official said several White House officials are concerned about the number of times Fauci has been wrong on things. Fauci, 79, heads the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and has been a prominent figure during the U.S.'s fight against the pandemic. The doctor said, as a country, when you compare us to other countries, I don't think you can say we're doing great. I mean, we're just not. He's accused states of opening up too quickly and skipping over guidelines. Of course, Fauci's been around for a long, long time. And during the 1980s, he was scaring people to death, telling them that AIDS was everyone's disease when it was obvious from the beginning that it was not everyone's disease. They got away with it. I know that I heard stories, incredible stories from people about, how they were terrified that they were going to get AIDS. And why would you get AIDS? Are you an IV drug user? No. You had a blood transfusion of bad blood? No. Do you have sex with men? No. Why do you think you're going to get AIDS? And I hear these stories about people using 2 condoms at a time, this sort of thing. And you had people, people would have some sort of bruise or lesion or whatever on their chest. It's, oh my God, I've got it. And they got away with it. They got away with scaring tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people across the West needlessly. And I don't know. I suppose they'll get away with it this time as well. I mean, AIDS didn't wreck the world's economy, although I'm sure a lot of the people like Fauci are looking back to it and saying, we could have done this back in the 1980s. We didn't realize then how much power we have. Let's see. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo says people traveling to his state from Florida will be fined $2,000 if they don't provide contact information to authorities when they arrive. Yes, and if that doesn't work, Cuomo will start firing on Fort Sumter. New York is actually lecturing the rest of the country. It's actually lecturing Florida. Why don't we compare deaths from state to state? David Sirota writes, in a normal society, one of the biggest scandals would be a state having 30,000 plus people die of COVID, as its governor gave immunity to nursing home CEOs after his political machine got $1 million from the lobby group that wrote the immunity legislation. How about that? How about that? This is a story from the Guardian, which is not known to be a pro-Trump journal. It's a story from a month ago. As Governor Andrew Cuomo faced a spirited challenge in his bid to win New York's 2018 Democratic primary, his political apparatus got a last-minute boost. A powerful healthcare industry group suddenly poured more than $1 million into a Democratic committee backing his campaign. Less than 2 years after that flood of cash from the Greater New York Hospital Association, Cuomo signed legislation last month quietly shielding hospital and nursing home executives from the threat of lawsuits stemming from the coronavirus outbreak. The provision, inserted into an annual budget bill by Cuomo's aides, created one of the nation's most explicit immunity protections for healthcare industry officials, according to legal experts. Critics say Cuomo removed a key deterrent against nursing home and hospital corporations cutting corners in ways that jeopardize lives. As those critics now try to repeal the provision during this final week of Albany's legislative session, they assert that data proves such immunity is correlating to higher nursing home death rates during the pandemic, both in New York and in other states enacting similar immunity policies. GNYHA, a lobbying group for hospital systems, including some that own nursing homes, said it drafted and aggressively advocated the immunity provision. The new law declares that top officials at hospital and nursing home companies shall have immunity from any liability, civil or criminal, for any harm or damages alleged to have been sustained as a result of an act or omission in the course of arranging for or providing healthcare services to address the COVID-19 outbreak. Prior to the budget language, Cuomo had already temporarily granted limited legal immunity to doctors and nurses serving on the medical front lines, but the carefully sculpted passage buried in the state's annual spending bill expanded that by offering extensive immunity to any healthcare facility administrator, executive, supervisor, board member, trustee, or other person responsible for directing, supervising, or managing a healthcare facility and its personnel, or other individual in a comparable role. New York is now just one of 2 states to shield those corporate officials from both civil lawsuits and some forms of criminal prosecution by the government. Yeah, it's the Love Gov who's dishing it 24/7. I guess it really helps if your brother is one of the anchors at CNN. They don't even need his brother. Everyone on CNN is sucking up to Andrew Cuomo. And I'm looking at this guy's face. He does not look like a friendly, likable person. He looks like a person that one would want to be afraid of. Janice Dean, who is the senior meteorologist at Fox News Channel, writes, I have received texts, emails, and direct messages from people, some reporters, who say that Cuomo is too powerful and too feared in New York, that he will never be held accountable for his terrible and deadly orders during this pandemic, no matter how glaring the evidence. What's he going to do? I mean, how can he threaten people? Oh, and someone has run a side-by-side of the Love Gov, who is doubled over in laughter, as his idiot younger brother Fredo holds up a giant Q-tip, as if he's in a Jerry Lewis movie. Okay. Yeah, before I get into AOC and her very amusing fantasies about New York's criminals, let's read a little here from Alex Berenson. This is from yesterday. After a week of nightmare headlines about Florida and about 70,000 new cases, aka positive tests, hospitals have a grand total of 130 more patients. That's about 2.5% more in ICU beds statewide than last Sunday. Can't make it up. 45 deaths today in a state with 20 million people. Someone had tweeted to him, it is fascinating to me that Cuomo has become the poster child for how to respond properly when his death rate is the worst, well, maybe second worst, over 3 times that of the next closest. I guess when you have a good-looking brother who is on the news, you get to spin the story. Berenson responds, fact check, good-looking. And you know what I think about Chris Cuomo? He has the 2 looks. The look where he appears to be about to burst into tears. And to steal a line from Armando Iannucci's show Veep, he has the, how would I say, the surprise masturbator look. Yes. How did that guy ever get on TV? Let's look at the deaths here. New York, 32,444. Florida, 4,277. They have the same population. And yet the Love Gov is lecturing Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. Now, you would think that someone in the media would say, come on, Governor, come on, knock it off, okay? Here are the numbers. How do you explain the numbers? If Florida is doing such a terrible job, how come your numbers, death numbers, are so much worse than Florida's? Let's see. Berenson writes, live look at the 5 states with the most SARS-CoV-2 cases. 2 of these, total population 28 million, have 48,000 deaths. 2 others, population 50 million, have 7,500 deaths. True story. Can you guess which 2 the media love or which 2 have Republican governors? Yeah. It's apparently Cuomo is going to be able to get away with anything, but we'll see. We'll see about this. I'm not so sure that he is getting away with it. I'd like to think that he's not going to get away with it, because it would just be, I mean, this guy's responsible for the death of thousands of people, and the death of thousands of people in terrible situations. No, you can't see your children. No, you can't see anybody. And no, there's not going to be a funeral or a wake after you die. No, 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 no. We can't have that. Let's go back to the chat briefly, and then I'm going to talk about China. Detroit. I'm going to be talking about Detroit in just a minute. Detroit metro area. Detroit has about 650,000 people. The surrounding counties, 3 million. A whole hell of a lot of whites and decent suburban people, like most big metro areas. And come on, I'm just saying, don't go there. And for God's sake, don't teach there. Jim Smith says, I think we can all agree on that. Once again, I've seen TV reports, I've seen YouTube videos of classrooms, let's say in the inner city, where everyone seems to be standing up. People are drifting in and out of the room. People are shouting, laughing, jumping up on desks, pushing people around in jest or otherwise. There's no learning that is taking place in that environment. It's simply not possible. If you're looking for a teaching job, the odds of finding one in Oakland County, Michigan are far less than Wayne County. Okay. Jim Smith says, I'm relieved my kids are done with school, and until grad school, never attended a public university or lower school. Well, lucky you. My son attended an elite college with a moderately liberal reputation, but he was a STEM major. It was the students that were the biggest influence in his case. Well, I wonder what's going to happen to STEM with Black Lives Matter. I'll get to that in a minute. Because what? Academics? Well, they're in trouble. They're problematic, aren't they? Too many dead white guys responsible for this. And there's going to have to be some changes made. AOC is very equine, says Chogokin666. She is. She needs to dial down the gesticulations, and particularly the facial movements, because if you look at her for more than about 30 seconds, she appears deranged. Halper says the Muslim who married her brother is vastly more appealing than AOC. Well, she's certainly more modest, both in her affect and in her, I don't know, her voice, Walrus Libertarian says all those people missing funerals, and then George Floyd's body paraded around like he was Julius Caesar. What do you think about the fact that all NHL games will be played in Edmonton and Toronto? Well, I guess they have to get people into Canada. They can't have them going back and forth. I don't know. Perhaps this is just sort of an acknowledgement that the NHL is more popular in Canada than it is in the United States. But, I just wonder how many Americans, as a rule, do not like to see, foreigners win athletic competitions. Of course, the last time that the Canadian team won the Stanley Cup was at the Montreal Canadiens in 1994. That's just absolutely remarkable. I've been reading about baseball and all of this sissified whining as, oh no, something bad could happen. Someone could get sick. Yeah, people get sick all the time. Baseball's a game where some guy throws a ball at you, a hard ball, at speeds of up to 100 miles an hour, pretty much right at your head. I mean, they're usually not trying to hit you in the head, but the ball ends up there on a regular basis, and you've got to get down in the dirt in a hurry, or you could suffer crippling injuries, but now we're all afraid of the air. Just shameful. Interesting expose from the Daily Mail. A leading figure in a Chinese group allegedly created to groom foreign elites has been pictured with 5 British prime ministers. Photographs uncovered by the Daily Mail show how Zhirong has moved among the British establishment. He has met Boris Johnson, Theresa May, David Cameron, Gordon Brown, and Tony Blair. Hu is a director of the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, which is reportedly controlled by the country's Communist Party. Academics say its mission is to groom business, political, and media leaders in countries around the world. The claims are backed by a new book, Hidden Hand, whose serialization continues in the mail today. It alleges that China is recruiting useful idiots to push the country's agenda in the West. Hu, who sits in China's upper parliamentary house, has also been pictured giving a thumbs up while posing shoulder to shoulder with Donald Trump in 2018. 8 years earlier, he was seen shaking hands in Shanghai with former U.S. President George W. Bush. I have to say that, politicians have pictures taken with thousands of people. Maybe it's whispered to them who these people are. Generally, they don't know who they are. I don't consider that in itself to be particularly significant. The revelations about how Beijing has infiltrated the British elite come as the National Security Council is poised to ban China's Huawei from involvement in the UK's 5G network tomorrow. Hu is variously described as a director and national director of the CPAFFC, which is linked to the Communist Party's United Front. It was described in a dossier compiled with the help of a former MI6 spy as being set up to pursue a United Front strategy in order to promote a party agenda abroad. The 86-page report entitled China's Elite Capture was leaked to this newspaper this week, and it makes a string of incendiary claims that Beijing was trying to manipulate key figures in the UK. Hidden Hand, written by Australian academic Clive Hamilton, a global authority on China, said of the CPAFFC, just as in the United Kingdom, no community organization can use the word royal in its title without official permission. In China, no community group would include the words people or friendship in its title without party approval. Friendship has a very distinct meaning, a cynical and opportunistic one. It does not refer to an intimate personal bond, but to a strategic relationship on behalf of the party. Such as Hu's standing in China that shortly after a parade in Tiananmen Square last October to celebrate 70 years of Communist Party rule, he posed for a photograph alongside Chairman Mao's grandson, Mao Zedong. In 2013, he was pictured with President Xi Jinping. Political sources in China suggest that Hu's access to establishment figures in the West is unprecedented. And there's a follow-up story here. Top Communist Party leaders in China are known as the Red Aristocracy, and for all their professed belief in equality, they like to ensure a gold-plated future for their children. Hence the so-called princelings who are placed in high-flying financial businesses in the West. For Western hedge funds, insurance companies, pension funds, and banks, a prerequisite for doing business in the lucrative Chinese capital markets is a network of connections to the families that dominate the party hierarchy. It's funny, I'm looking at a picture of London here, and at first I thought it was a picture of Beijing or Shanghai. And it's sad, it's depressing, and it's infuriating that all cities look alike now. Increasingly, well, I suppose I recognize the so-called Gherkin building, but just these hideous mammoth structures which are now cleverly designed to appear as if they're going to fall down on top of your head. Hang on a second. Giving jobs to the sons, daughters, nephews, and nieces of these families brings immediate guanxi, the particular Chinese word that implies networking and the exchange of favors. It is essential to the way the Chinese do business. The offspring need not be well qualified or even especially bright. It's the connections that count. The American banking house J.P. Morgan operated what it called the Sons and Daughters program. which provided dozens of jobs in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and New York to children of the party elite. One was Gao Zhu, the son of China's Commerce Minister Gao Hucheng. Gao Zhu landed a job after a meeting between his father and senior JP Morgan executive William Daley. Daley was a former U.S. Commerce Secretary under Bill Clinton and pushed for China's entry into the World Trade Organization. He later served as President Obama's chief of staff. Gao Zhu interviewed poorly, but was offered a coveted analyst position with the bank. Prone to falling asleep at work, he was soon judged to be a, quote, immature, irresponsible, and unreliable, unquote, employee. When, as part of a general downsizing, the bank later wanted to lay him off, his father took the head of the bank's Hong Kong office, Fang Fang, to dinner and pleaded for his son to be kept on, promising to go extra miles for JP Morgan in its China deals. Fang was persuaded, and a senior executive in New York agreed to keep Gao Zhu on, even though the executive's own son had been laid off. Business is business. When Gao Zhu was eventually let go, he took other finance jobs before winding up at Goldman Sachs. As one equity executive told the Financial Times, "You don't say no to a princeling." Which begs the question, no, it doesn't beg the question. That means something else. That means assuming something to be true that has not been demonstrated. It raises the question of what else the banks can do for the party elite besides employing their children. European financial institutions have gone the same way. In Zurich, a Credit Suisse kept a spreadsheet that tracked princeling hires against how much money they brought in. It hired more than 100 sons, daughters, and friends of senior government officials. One princess was employed after the company helped massage her resume. Once on the payroll, she often didn't show up for work. When she did, she was judged rude and unprofessional and sometimes brought her mother with her. Nevertheless, she was paid $1 million during her employment and given a number of promotions because her family awarded deals to the bank. Is this what they call best practices? I want to talk a little bit about millennials. I mentioned Spiked. A fellow who writes for it frequently is called Frank Ferruti. He was associated with Living Marxism. He has a new book out. Parents' failures to enforce boundaries and unwillingness to chastise children has led to a generation of infantilized millennials, according to a sociology professor. In his book, Why Borders Matter, Frank Ferruti, emeritus professor of sociology at Kent University, says a lack of clear boundaries has created a childlike generation. Not chastising children or using moral-based judgments deprives them of a natural process of fighting against parental rules and boundaries. He says children develop by pushing against boundaries given to them by parents and society. And over 3 or 4 generations, those parameters have weakened. This has led to millennials in their 20s acting the way they did in their teenage years and refusing to embrace adulthood. Millennials were born between 1980 and 1994, so the oldest of the generation are now 40, and the youngest are in their mid-20s. And there's some art here from Shutterstock, some stock art. And there's 3 people sitting on a couch, Chesterfield, and 2 of them have, well, one of them has a laptop, one of them has a notebook. 3 of them have smartphones, and they're staring down at them because they're very, I suppose, they're model types, you know. But just the assumption that there's not going to be any human contact between these people. We see a black man who's he seems to be very amused by what he's looking at the laptop. I'm sure it's far more amusing than any contact that he might have with the rather attractive black woman who's sitting next to him. Ferretti's book, Why Borders Matter, was inspired in part by the response to Donald Trump's 2016 Build the Wall campaign slogan. Ferretti said there was extreme response from some communities who painted the idea of national boundaries as oppressive, discriminatory, exploitative, and violent. While preparing for a talk on borders, a sociologist was researching identity crisis in children and realized that a lack of boundaries could be why children are increasingly behaving in a confused and defensive way. This prevailing anti-border narrative appears to have a link to a wider change in society over the past few decades, and that is what he set out to study. Every single boundary that used to give meaning to life was being called into question by the same people who hated national borders, Freddie told Mail Online. One of the things about developing as a child is you kick off against your parents and build your inner strength and confidence. This is leading to a generation of adults who don't want to grow up, or if they do grow up, are doing so in their 30s rather than their 20s. This is backed up by data from the Office for National Statistics, which found many people are hitting key milestones, such as marriage or home ownership later in life. British people are starting full-time jobs, moving out of their parents' homes, and having children later than any previous generation. In his book, Freddie goes into the issue of a lack of boundaries in personal life between parents and children, public and private, and even national borders. Every border, even borders between children and adults, are now seen in a dubious way, and the historic boundary separating children and adults is called into question. It became very clear to me that any form of cultural distinction that has given meaning to human experience is now being contested. He says that all is not lost and things can be reversed, but people first need to relearn the art of drawing borders in personal, political, and national spheres. He said we must take the question of moral judgment more seriously, including learning how to make moral judgments and enter a debate on a topic. It is under those circumstances we gain the confidence to bring clear guidance and meaning to our experiences, and we stop relying on hoping things will be okay. By being more morally judgmental and defining a national value, Freddie says we can bring children up much more freedom-loving, much more open. We need to find what binds us together as a community and as a nation and build back boundaries with our children that have been dismantled. What's happening now is that they are kicking against open doors, which is really what is going on. Then the whole developmental process becomes compromised. This leads to a situation where the transition from childhood to adolescence takes much, much longer than ever before. And the transition from adolescence to adulthood also takes much longer. Freddie said he once saw a man wearing a t-shirt saying, "I'm done with adulting," which he claims is an example of this inability of millennials to embrace adulthood. Mothers take their 18-year-olds shopping, and it's their daughter that tells them what to wear, not the other way around. Fathers are out wearing the same clothes as their sons and listening to the same music, adding that it leads to an almost conscious effort not to be a father to your child or a mother, but to be their best friend. They can make their best friend with their peers. They need somebody that can look up to, someone that can inspire them. There is this estrangement from adulthood. You have someone like Greta Thunberg being put on a pedestal to lecture these horrible adults. And instead of telling her to get down and do her homework, adults are taking the knee and asking her if she wants a Nobel Peace Prize. He said that this distaste for borders is prominent in the West, particularly in Anglo-American nations such as the UK and the US. It is important not to be complacent as these ideas percolate through American soft power. People watch Netflix all over the world, and you watch their program, and the child will come across as superior to bad-tempered adults. This has been common on television for decades now, that the whole point of children on these shows is to wisecrack and make their parents, particularly their fathers, look like fools. Without the discipline of boundaries, there is little to guide people as they make their way in the world. He said that the boundary in politics between public and private lives has been blurred as part of the dismantling of borders, fueling identity politics. He said this has led to a paradox in society where young people have been raised without facing the judgment of their parents or of their actions. So in turn, they refuse to accept the same judgment in others. He said that safe spaces, the idea that certain things shouldn't be discussed for fear of upsetting or triggering people, is an example of them finding borders. He said that these spaces are just an opportunity for people to ban those with views who clash with their own, and is part of identity politics. The thing about identity politics is that every expression they use is actually a contradiction. They talk about diversity. That's one of the key values of identity politics, but identity politics is totally hostile to a diversity of viewpoints. So if you argue a different narrative to what they are arguing, that is seen as racist, as offensive, or hate. Freddie said that the same sort of people who go about policing cultures, telling others they can't have their hair that way, or tearing down statues, are only interested in selective, deep-rooted cultures. You know, we've talked about this in the past, that essay by, what was it, Jason Segel, that the people who are most engaged in cancel culture, They do not know how to argue. Essentially, they are like, I don't know, a priest or a pastor saying blasphemy or sacrilege. Now, actually, the Inquisition was very good at arguing, because if you're going to, condemn someone as a heretic, you better have the goods there. But now it's just the argument from authority. And what authority? I am so pissed off about this. I can't, etc., etc. Oh, this is just too much for me. Let's see. It was. Look at this here. There's a little sidebar here defining the generations from silent to centennial. Generation Alpha, born 2010 to the present day. They grew up with smartphones and tablets as a major part of their childhood entertainment. Generation Z, or iGen, or Centennials, born 1995 to 2010. Those born after 1995 are growing up in a world that has always been associated with technology for them. They are the most connected, educated, and sophisticated. No, they are not. No, they are not. The most educated? Educated in what? Exactly. Because typically, if you look at the millennials or generation with the millennials, it's as if the world began roughly the year 2000. If you look at Generation Z, the world began roughly, say, 2010. That there is an almost total lack of historical consciousness there. I suppose even with Generation X, as much as they hate the boomers, there's a certain historical consciousness of the dreaded 1960s, because the boomers simply won't shut up about it. And then, I don't know, for people of my generation, there was the Second World War, and there was before that the Depression. We grew tired of parents continually talking about the Depression and the poorhouse and the like, but we understood that something very bad had happened in the 1930s, and not before that, not that many years removed, was World War I. But I don't know. Knowledge of history is not considered to be, I suppose, part of education anymore. Story from Fresh Daily. A Calgary brewery is pulling their Karen Cherry Sour beer from shelves this week after facing backlash over the name, a widely recognized term for demanding, privileged white woman. The team at the Common Crown Brewing Company apologized for the beer, saying it was tone deaf to racial developments. What? The now discontinued beer featured a drawing of a white woman with the company's Crown logo on her head. The company advertised the beer alongside slogans such as, "Can we speak to your manager?" and "Celebrate Karen with us today." It seems rather amusing to me, actually. But no, this somehow has something to do with Black Lives Matter. Oh my God, you can't make jokes. Can't make jokes. People on social media were quick to criticize. People on social media quick to criticize something. The beer can for appearing to trivialize the recent Black Lives Matter movement that's been sweeping across Canada. This is absolutely shocking, one person wrote. And the fact that this went all the way through with not one person in their company challenging the idea says a lot about the people who work there. Gross. No. It's tone deaf and kind of mean-spirited given the way things are right now. Yes, groveling apology. They missed the mark and they promised to do better. Tone deaf to racial developments is not an excuse. So you can't make fun of white women anymore, except that you can't, I don't know. Kyle Smith, who is at National Review and the New Criterion, formerly of the New York Post. The best-selling rock albums during the first half of 2020. This is from Billboard. Number 1, Queen's Greatest Hits, which came out in 1981. Number 2, Elton John's Diamonds, which came out in 2017. Number 3, Creedence Clearwater Revival's Chronicle Volume 1, which came out in 1976. Number 4, Journey's Greatest Hits, 1988. And number 5, Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, which came out in 1977. 5 rock bands older than the CD, to say nothing of iTunes and Spotify. Rock is so dead, Carl Smith says. I suppose so. But the music, starting around the year 2000, the music industry decided that it did not want to make music that white men would like, because they're harder to sell to than women, particularly barely pubescent women, and homosexuals, well, and black people for that matter. It's all disposable, and it's meant to be disposable. These people are made stars before they've even put out a record. You must have this record because every other girl has got it. Okay. Or everyone else, in the hood has got this. And I've noticed several times in the past that if you go to see, where men are working at construction sites or the like, that they're going to have their boom boxes, say, and what are they going to be listening to? Well, one of the things they're going to be listening to is CCR and Led Zeppelin and maybe Queen and AC/DC. That I suppose if the record companies won't make records that they want to listen to, well, they can listen to the old stuff. That's not going anywhere. This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. Black Lives Matter teacher says 2 + 2 only equals 4 because of Western imperialism. This is Brittany Marshall, she, her, teacher, scholar, social justice change agent, Chicagoan, PhD student, Rutgers GSE, architecture enthusiast, wannabe math person, BLM, always. Yeah, 2 + 2 equals 4. It's cultural, and because of Western imperialism, colonization, we think of it as the only way of knowing. Well, it's an interesting point and not as shallow as it might seem, because we don't believe in magical thinking. It was St. Augustine who pretty much created the framework of Western thinking, abandoning magical thinking. But you see that magical thinking is making a big comeback. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Well, how do you know that? Because it's in some textbook. Maybe there's a shortcut. That's magical thinking, right? Maybe the idea of white supremacy. That's magical thinking. When you hear the BLM people carry on about white people, they are ascribing magical powers to white people. Apparently, as we learned from Lainey Liu, the Canadian gossip blogger and TV personality, that white supremacy is so powerful that it can make Chinese women like her white, and thus oblivious to the pain suffered by black people, oblivious to their own white privilege, even if your skin is not actually white. Be interesting to see what happens when BLM people start getting their hooks into normal academics. Because do you think that they're going to be happy with their Black Studies departments? No. They want to run everything. Let's see. Unfortunately, it's nothing new. There are videos circulating showing black students promoting to stop science because it represents white supremacy. They would prefer magic and voodoo. Well, you see, if a white man tells you that 2 + 2 equals 4, then it's suspect, isn't it? It has to be suspect because white people are by their nature evil, and white people are by their nature looking to oppress black people. So there can be no such thing as disinterested science if white people are involved in it. And All Lives Matter has become the new N-word. A young Indiana mother was shot dead in front of her fiance after she reportedly told a group of Black Lives Matter supporters that all lives matter over the 4th of July weekend. Jessica Doty Whitaker, 24, was taking a stroll with her fiance, Jose Ramirez, and two others near the Indianapolis Canal Walk around 3 a.m. on July the 5th. That was a bad idea. That was a bad idea to begin with. You know, Bill Cosby, he's in prison now, but he once said something that was useful, which is that nothing good happens after midnight. You don't want to be walking along a canal in Indianapolis or probably anywhere else at 3 a.m. Ramirez says that the four of them were hanging out when one of them used a slang version of the N-word. I don't know what that means. But a group of people nearby, reportedly comprised of 4 men and 1 woman, objected to hearing the phrase, and a confrontation ensued between the two sets of strangers. I see Whitaker was a home health nurse and had a 3-year-old son named Grayson. During the argument, the offended individuals reportedly shouted Black Lives Matter, to which either Whitaker or someone else responded, All Lives Matter. Robert Doty, the victim's father, confirmed with the Daily Wire that his daughter said All Lives Matter during the exchange. Ramirez said both groups brandished guns at each other, but eventually talked through the issues, fist bumped, and walked away from each other. It was squashed, and they went up the hill and left, we thought, but they were sitting on St. Clair, waiting for us to come under the bridge, and that's when she got shot. Well, you want to keep my advice in mind. A, always be avoiding. So this is from Reddit. The young mother shot by BLM for saying all lives matter should be national news. Sorry, this post has been removed by the moderators of r/unpopular opinion. Moderators remove posts from feeds for a variety of reasons, including keeping communities safe, civil, and true to their purpose. This thread has been locked by the moderators of r/unpopular opinion. New comments cannot be posted. So let's just strangle this story in the crib, as it were. Ryan Landry writes in the American Sun, and I'm going to be reviewing his book about masculinity in a couple of weeks' time. He writes, Detroit is a Rorschach test. Bring it up to a circle of friends and watch people come up with different explanations for its demise. Corporate greed, free trade, anti-working man, racism, the blacks, Democrat mismanagement. There was no magic bullet to assassinating it. To get to Coleman Young, a study and system runs through a large, multivariable process. What is undeniable is the third world, unsalvageable place it is today. A recent trip to the Motor City was one of those events where just the drive in kills liberalism. There are billboards asking blacks to do basic human duties. Other billboards are reminders of basic activities that after the third one, I expected to see a billboard saying, brush your teeth or remember to flush. It was funny until I remembered that Detroit provides the winning margin for the Democrats and Michigan is a crucial electoral vote prize. Idiocracy is not the future. You live in it now. The dilapidated homes start out far from the core and fill acres. Detroit is a perfect example of the locust nature of cities. This is enabled by our large tracts of unused land and the middlemen who make money on transactions. Detroit was a company town built up for manufacturers. Cheap labor got sucked into the area. The elite pulled in more labor for the war. Ancillary businesses sprouted. Everything went well, but then the jobs started to leave and the scum stuck around. Everyone fled except the most miserable who cannot think 10 blocks from their home. Once ruined, it empties. If you have visited 20 urban cores, seeing empty lots of overgrown grass right next to skyscrapers is a jarring juxtaposition. There was nothing organic to the city's formation, and it shows how fast it was discarded after being used and abused. This is the pattern elsewhere. Core, white Americans build. The underclass locusts enter. The regime does not enforce safety. White flight, then striver black flight, and then all that is left are old blacks, predator blacks, and the welfare class. The end result is a few residences, drug flop houses, and empty lots. Potential gentrification opportunities, but nothing else. Potential is key because why else would billionaire Dan Gilbert financially take care of the hip-hop convict mayor Kwame Kilpatrick? Detroit is unique, but still the story of America. California is presented as a possible future, but so is Detroit. California does not have a duplicate yet, but wait on Texas. But Detroit has Baltimore, Gary, East St. Louis, etc. City-states do not have to be glittering Singapore or Hong Kong megacities. And he linked to a story from 7 years ago. Nearly half of Detroit's adults are functionally illiterate, report finds. That's 47%, 200,000 total, functionally illiterate, meaning they have trouble with reading, speaking, writing, and computational skills. Even more surprisingly, the Detroit regional workforce finds half of that illiterate population has obtained a high school degree. Not surprising to me. Yes. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's speaking on the crime wave in New York City. Maybe this has to do with the fact that people aren't paying the rent and are scared to pay the rent, and so they go out and they need to feed their children, and they don't have money, so they feel like they either have to shoplift some bread or go hungry. Yes, and my little joke was that the New York police have issued an all-points bulletin for a man called Jean Valjean. You can't eat sneakers, AOC. You can't eat big screen TVs. I wonder, does she really believe this? I'd be curious to know what the chat thinks about this. Oh, there's record unemployment in the U.S., AOC says. And I wonder why that would be. Because governments like government of New York State decided to smash the economy. Sheer blind panic. Of course, the police are still enforcing the most important laws. This is from the West Midlands Police. We were alerted to a series of racist messages sent to a footballer today, and after looking into them and conducting checks, we have arrested a boy. The 12-year-old from Solihull has been taken to custody. Thanks to everyone who raised it. Racism will not be tolerated. Orwell and Good comments, arresting a 12-year-old for edgy tweet. Yes. Protecting 12-year-olds from grooming gangs. No. No. That would be racist. And I'm running out of time here, but Dennis Dale is still filing. Fascinating stuff from the siege of Portland by Antifa. He's at dennisdale.blogspot.com, or you can search under Untethered, and I highly recommend it. The Washington Redskins have announced they're not going to be the Washington Redskins anymore. I wonder if they're going to come up with a name that is not that's not a multiple. You know, it's just a singular and not a plural. Because I hate those names. I really hate those names. But that seems to be what the teams do now. I was going to talk about Margaret Trudeau, and I don't want to shrift that because she's a fascinating woman, and her life tells a lot about the recent history of my country. So I will get back to that tomorrow. I mentioned Alex Berenson. On Friday, I'm going to be discussing his book about marijuana, which is called Tell Your Children. And spoiler alert, he is not a fan. And on Thursday, one of the great films ever made, a Technicolor classic. Guess what? Conservatism Inc. hates this movie. It's called The Searchers, directed by John Ford from 1956, and it stars John Wayne and Natalie Wood. So one final look at the chat. Brandon Smith says, all the clowns are busily employed insisting on a grim future together. You know, I suppose there's a certain exhilaration to collapse or to rapid decline at first. But I have to think that that exhilaration dissipates. Because I don't know, people are expecting some sort of, as Christopher Booker called it in his Jungian analysis, an explosion into reality, into a new reality. Well, the situation we have now is we just have all these people out of work and people forbidden to do various things. And where's the explosion? Well, there hasn't been an explosion yet. And I think that people are going to be fed up with this very, 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 very soon. 2020, the year of our discount tent, sans sheets. KMG, so nice to be home and hear the show. Normalcy bias, blessings all, and good night. That is from MCT. Why, thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I can't stand jazz, says Metal Mike. I don't listen to very much jazz. I like the West Coast stuff and not the East Coast stuff. And I like the bossa nova and the fusion between the American jazzers and the Brazilians. Anyway, that is it for today. I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I'd appreciate it if you'd click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to donate to my live stream, which would be greatly appreciated, especially at this trying time, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Once again, kevin_grace@hotmail.com. And I will leave you with this. In these times of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly hope that all of my dear listeners and viewers manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.